Hello, hello. Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome. How are we doing today? Can I get some pluses in the chat if you can hear me, team? Okay. Good. If you're having trouble accessing the chat, just refresh. Sometimes it takes a minute getting to a live in order for the chat to be active. So, let's get started, shall we? So, today is our penultimate or second to last lesson of Othello before we start moving toward Streetcar Named Desire, which will be our next text that we cover after half term. My Headspace half term is the first week of November, so next week. So you'll have a 1 week break, and then we will be moving to a once a week structure in which we have this lesson on Wednesdays, where we just have a bit more time to concentrate on those Wednesdays on the text itself. The Friday lessons will be changed, so you won't lose any of the lessons, but they'll just be taken over on Wednesday. So you will still have the same amount of lessons, just spread over more time as we keep going. But that will mean that we have more time to think and to work together and to develop ideas in our work going forwards. But if this is your first time, welcome to the Key Stage 5 My Headspace free streams for English. This is our 15th free stream for Key Stage 5 for English this year. We have been doing all of these streams completely for free on YouTube, and savable, of course, and able to go back to at any time. We have been focusing since September on Othello. If this is your first time, you may find it beneficial to go back to the beginning and take a look at all of our content on Othello, because there is quite a lot of it at this point, going from introducing Othello, introducing Shakespearean tragedy, talking about the plot and the characters, analysing the key characters and analysing the key themes, and starting to develop lines of argument around them. In today's lesson and in Friday's lesson, we are going to be looking at what comes next after that. So thinking about this in terms of essays. So if you are in A-level literature classes, you will be doing much of your essay writing without the guidance of your teacher. You may be introduced to ideas or topics by your teacher, but you will not have the same support with writing it out and looking in as much detail at the process from getting an exam question into how to develop this argument. So that is what we're going to be looking at today and on Friday, with two different themes, so that you have a bit more practice looking at how these skills are applicable with different questions. So, if you're new here, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers for My Headspace. I've taught Key Stage 5 for quite a number of years at this point, and I'm now working as part of the My Headspace team to deliver this free Key Stage 5 content to you. So let's get started with these questions to see what you know first. So this begins with what could be considered Othello's hamartia, or his fatal flaw that leads to his downfall. Who is prejudiced in the play? Who is a victim of prejudice? So thinking about the dynamics there of prejudice. What kinds of prejudice exist in the play, and in what specific ways was Jacobean society prejudiced? So feel free to put your answers into the chat so that you can check them, so that you can engage with us and learn with us, because of course I'll be able to see them and provide you with any feedback. So that will be beneficial for you as well, because that will mean that you get feedback from me as well as from your teachers, or from whichever way you are learning your subject. Okay, so let's get started with who is prejudiced, or what could be considered Othello's hamartia here. Well, most famously, we have Othello's hamartia as jealousy. Because in simplest version of this play, Othello's made to be jealous or led to be jealous, is jealous, and is destroyed by jealousy. Kills his wife, goes mad, and ends up dying as a result. We could also say that his insecurity is his hamartia. This is part of the flaw that makes him vulnerable to this destruction, to this provocation by Iago. We could also say that it is because he's overly trusting. He puts his trust in the wrong person. It could be his outsider status that makes him vulnerable, because he's so willing to believe an insider of Venetian society when his reputation is supposedly threatened. We could also say it's his mistrust of Desdemona, or his incorrect view of Desdemona as something that's idolized, or something that's not entirely understood, a person who's not entirely understood or entirely human to him. Perhaps it also could be his volatility. What do I mean by that? I mean that he is so quick to fly off the handle when his jealousy or his suspicions are activated. And can we also say perhaps his poor judgment? Leavis in particular thinks of of his judgment as a weakness of his, and this being a play about tragic weakness of Othello, and it being Othello's fault, really. Then, this is not an inexhaustive list, but certainly a good start to think about Othello's hamartia here. It's definitely arguable, which is the point here, is you can argue it's one of these as long as you can support your point. Then who is prejudiced in the play? So who is doing the prejudice here? Well, we have Iago, first of all, definitely. I hate them all. We have Brabantio, who is Desdemona's father. We have Rodrigo, one of Desdemona's slighted suitors. We have Emilia, who uses racialized epithets with Othello. We have the Venetians more broadly, excluding perhaps the Duke of Venice. Cassio is not a Venetian, he's a Florentinian, he's from Florence, so he wouldn't count in that either. And then also we have Othello himself as prejudiced, right? He's prejudiced not only in the fact that he has internalized the racial prejudices of the Venetians, but also he's prejudiced in his view of women as either Madonnas or whores, as we've seen previously. Then, who is a victim of prejudice? We have Othello, definitely, as a victim of prejudice, particularly racial prejudice. We also have Desdemona as a victim not only of Othello's prejudice, but of Iago, Brabantio, Rodrigo, thinking about the graphic sexual imagery they use essentially to attack her character and to dehumanize her in Act 1 as well. We have perhaps Bianca, a prejudice in the misogyny that she is treated with, but also in this unconfirmed expectational view that she's a sex worker. They call her as such and treat her as such, but who is it who's calling her this? Iago. Cassio, who is sleeping with her. Emilia, who's a married housewife and thus would look down on Bianca for her seemingly impure behaviour with Cassio. Could we also say Emilia, perhaps, as another woman in the play who is subject to the misogyny of men? Perhaps. Then what kinds of prejudice exist in the play? We have quite a few. We have racial prejudice. We have xenophobic prejudice. What does that mean? That means fear of outsiders. Fear of outsiders. Particularly, this can be ascribed to race, nationality, religion, cultural differences. Anyone who is afraid of and or prejudiced towards people from a different place or a different culture would be considered xenophobic. Then we have gender misogynistic prejudice. We have this idea of prejudice versus reality, so the appearance then of prejudice. So for example, if we're thinking about what prejudice means to judge unfairly or before you get to know, to prejudge someone. So if we think about that, we can think about all of those scenes in which Iago leads Othello to doubt Desdemona and to conclude, based on these many scenes, that Desdemona is unfaithful, but he relies really on the prejudice of the appearance of these little meetups or little interactions without actually verifying them and being able to prod beneath his own prejudice, perhaps about women or about his own ability to keep and control a woman like Desdemona. We also have religious prejudice. Though Othello is described as a Christian, it's implied that he is not a born Christian. He is a convert, which means that he was raised as a different religion and at one point chose to convert to Christianity. Hello, welcome. I can see people popping into the chat. Welcome. We're just going over a review at this point. So this idea that the judgment against Othello because he is not born a Christian at the time, but also the fact that they call him a Moor, and a Moor being a word that links specifically to this idea of Islam here. So this idea that because he is black, because he is from the north of Africa, because he is not a born Christian, that he somehow retains these influences of a different religion, a religion that the Christians at the time would have thought as pagan, so as unholy to them. It's not our meaning of it these days, but there we are, that's how they would have described it. We also have this idea, perhaps, of age prejudice, though this only appears briefly when Othello says, well, perhaps it's because of my age, and occasionally Iago will attack Othello by saying he's old, essentially. But this really not being a major form of prejudice. Much more importantly is something like internalized prejudice. So we start with racial prejudice, but then as the play carries on, we have Othello as becoming prejudiced towards black people himself. So him internalizing these racial prejudices and saying things like, her name, which was once as fresh as Diane's visage, is now as black and begrimed as mine own face. So thinking of blackness as linked with evil and dirt and badness and contamination is something that now Othello is saying, so we can see that he has taken in this and he feels he deserves the treatment he has by the end of the play. We could also potentially say this idea of the audience's prejudices, right? Because Othello, in his portrayal here as a nobleman brought low through this tragedy derived from the Greek convention, we're perhaps having our own prejudices unlocked or tapped at or questioned here in Shakespeare's project, right? Because we're meant by the end of the play to view Othello as this tragic hero who's been brought low. And perhaps part of Shakespeare's project is to subvert our own view of prejudice, this normalization of prejudice in society. Then in what ways specifically was Jacobean society prejudiced? Well, we have, for example, religious prejudice really dominating the grounds for prejudice at the time, because this was a predominantly Christian society ruled by a king who was also the head of the church. And this was a particularly tumultuous time for the English people and religion, because King James I tightened the restrictions on Catholic practice, and there was a rise in anti-Catholic sentiment. This was reinforced also by the anti-Spanish propaganda. The Spanish Empire was Catholic, and part of these attempts of the Spanish to conquer England or to go to war with England was this idea that they needed to be brought back under the control of the Pope and the Catholic Church, because this splintering from the Catholic Church in the Protestant Reformation, and as a result of King Henry VIII's split, wanting to divorce and marry Anne Boleyn, led to this idea of England being something that needed to be reconquered and saved, and have a Catholic monarch back on the throne. So for example, Gunpowder Plot was an attempt to depose by killing or assassinate King James I and replace him with a Catholic monarch instead. So we can see that this is a very contemptuous time here, but also this was religious because it was anti-Islam or Islamophobic, because of the Ottoman Empire's increasing reach across Europe. The Ottoman Empire, as we've seen before when we looked at Edward Said and Orientalism, this idea of it being this kind of opposite, this antithetical empire to the British Empire, whose reigning religion, whose evangelizing religion was Islam rather than Christianity, particularly Protestantism. So this fear then, excuse me, that the Ottoman Empire, which was so powerful, the other kind of big world force here, would eventually take over or become more powerful than the British Empire. And all of this religious, Christian, etc. prejudice also stemmed from their presentations of good and evil within Christianity. Because good was associated with light, whiteness, purity. God was the light of the world, and goodness was associated with cleanliness. Hence, baptism, for example, being linked with being clean, wedding dresses and baptismal robes being white meant this idea of purity was associated with white, and holiness was associated with white, and evil was associated with blackness. Excuse me. So the devil and the absence of God was linked with blackness, and thus anyone who exhibited blackness in their external appearance, who was black, or had any physiognomy-esque traits of blackness or marks on their skin, would be associated with evil, with witchcraft, and with devilry. So that really influences their opinions on race and xenophobia. In that, this is when ideas of empire were really developing. And England was being thought of as right and good and the centre of the world, the centre of reason, sophistication, evolution, culture, civilization, etc. Anything that was not England was the opposite. So, Othello, for example, is not English, is from somewhere where black people are in charge and where they practice a different religion and speak a different language, would be not accepted in England at the time. They would be automatically assumed to be the enemy, to be far from God's light. And this fear was also influenced by the age of discovery in which explorers and colonizers were going out to search the world for new trade routes and new lands, and establishing themselves as rulers of these newly discovered lands. These explorers and colonizers came back with tales and narratives about their discoveries, many of which are sensationalized in England at the time. Stories of cyclopses, anthropomorphi, and creatures from sort of Greek mythology onwards, all supposedly discovered, as well as people of different skin tones who were thought to be uncivilized, savage, barbaric, and have these completely, to an English mind, unusual and unacceptable views and practices and beliefs and cultures. So there as well. As well, finally, we have these ideas of gender prejudice here within a patriarchal society, so a particularly strict patriarchal society, in which women were automatically assumed to be weak, corruptible, uncontrollable. They were meant to be guarded and protected by the men in their lives because they were incapable of preserving their own moral integrity on their own. They were viewed as flighty and fragile, and as one of two things. So firstly and foremost, as the biblical Eve. So Eve from Genesis, who tempts Adam and leads him into eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and being sent away and condemned from the Garden of Eden. This was how woman was presented in the Bible and in the teachings of Jacobean England, was that women are weak, women are temptresses, and men need to be in charge in order to ensure that they don't destroy us all, really. And for the women who fulfilled the expectations of the time were aligned with the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, who was pure, chaste, perfect, uncorrupted, and exemplified the roles of mother and daughter and wife, but without this corruption of the earthly desires of pleasure, etc. So we have a lot of different ideas here to talk about prejudice. You can imagine that this is because we're talking about prejudice as one of our exam questions. So this is a potential exam question that could come up in your paper for A-level. So Vision Vibe, I think you asked, what exam board is this? This is for any exam board, but for A-level literature. So looking at A level, particularly taught in the UK, when we're talking about assessment objectives, but really this would be preparing anyone for future study in English, or for particularly people studying Othello, whatever exam board that would be. This will help you prepare for eventual exams. Okay, so it's not often that you have a theme and then just nothing else. So it's not common that they have explore how Shakespeare presents prejudice, because that's so broad that the examiners think that by giving a slightly more specific question, you're able to address it more easily, because there's so much to talk about prejudice, as we can see here, that this won't fit in your hour and 15 minutes you have to write a full essay in exam conditions. So, for example, they'll often give you something like prejudice as harmful. Okay, so then we can think about all of the ways, and we will do that in a moment. But just to note the other part of the question, be sure to include reference to contextual factors. What does that mean? That means background. So background about the Jacobean era, about society at the time, about the values and the zeitgeist of Jacobean culture, and the contemporary audience as well. So for example, all those ideas about the age of discovery would all link there. And then literary criticism. So we've looked at a lot of literary critics in our time over the last 14 lessons, this being our 15th. So this would be incorporating critics, incorporating the information we've learned from articles about Othello that professors and scholars and critics have published, and incorporating this into our work. And we've looked at, in our previous lesson, many different critics have different opinions and different focuses when we're talking about Othello. So they focus on gender, they focus on jealousy, they focus on post-colonialism, they focus on race, they focus on if it Othello's fault or not, right? So that is something we need to include. If we're looking at the A-level literature assessment objectives, or AOs as they're often referred to, so AO1 for example, what is this question asking you to do? And this is for, on the left hand of your screen, it is AQA, and on the right hand, it's your Edexcel one. So those are the most common exam boards that we have. For this question, you are assessed on AO1, AO2, AO3, and AO5. And the same for Edexcel, 1, 2, 3, and 5. Now, what does that mean you're actually being marked on? You're being marked on, firstly, your informed, personal, creative responses to literary text. So that means that you know the text, you're exhibiting that you know the text really well, and that you're able to create lines of argument to discuss the text in detail, that you're using quotations in your argument and using ideas from the text, and that you're crafting this in a way that makes sense and is able to understand. With AO2, this is the phrase that really stands out to me here, how meanings are shaped here, how meanings are shaped. That means all of your literary devices, your choices, your symbols, your motifs, your setting, because this is a play, all your drama devices as well. For example, Iago's asides, all of that is in AO2. That's where you're being assessed on that. And what's much more important is how meanings are shaped. So, okay, they include all of these symbols. For example, the handkerchief. What does that mean about prejudice? What does that mean for the argument? You need to explain that. That's the key detail there. AO3 is demonstrate understanding of the significance and influence of context in which they are written and received. So that means not only understanding what the time period was like in which Shakespeare wrote the text, what were the values of the culture at the time, what was their perception, for example, of blackness at the time, but also what Shakespeare's audience would react to in this play. How would they view Othello? How would they expect Othello to be seen here, and why would they be surprised at certain parts of the text? Or why would their beliefs be reinforced at other parts of the text? How do their values, in other words, leak into and reflect the text and the audience here? And then AO4 is not assessed because this is not a comparison question. So for prose, so I'm thinking particularly for Edexcel, so for example, your women and culture, or your study of Dracula, Frankenstein, etc. there, A Thousand Splendid Suns, Hardy, you are then not doing that for drama, so you don't have to worry about comparing the two texts that you would be for prose. But you do have to, as AO5 says, explore literature text informed by different interpretations. So your interpretation needs to be supported and interacting with critics' interpretations. But notice interpretation, not quotations. So that means you not only need to have and know critics' ideas word for word, but you also need to be able to interpret them, so know what they mean, and apply them into your own argument and say, see, look who also believes what I believe, or look at what this person says, I actually disagree. And notice the phrasing is, if not identical, extremely similar across these exam boards, which shows that they are looking for the same ideas. Friendly gaming, hello. Can I tell you about active and inactive what? Yeah, I think I need a little bit more detail for that, I'm afraid. But feel free to put in the chat and hopefully I can explain briefly. Okay, so if we're thinking about a question on prejudice, prejudice being harmful. Okay, so we know it's not positive prejudice, but we can't think of any time where prejudice is not harmful in the text, right? So all of prejudice is harmful. So we need to then think about not just who is prejudiced, but the effect prejudice has on people. So for example, the prejudice of the Venetians. Here, not only what their prejudice looks like, but also how it spreads, right? How they react with prejudice. So I'm thinking particularly Act 1 here. Prejudiced reactions to example of Othello marrying Desdemona. We also want to think about, because this would predominantly be racial prejudice, right? We would also want to think about how this racial prejudice affects Othello. For example, it makes him an outsider, and thus potentially as vulnerable to insecurity or to Iago. It makes him, as well, insecure about his position in society and thus more willing to protect his reputation. And as Zemi said, he starts to internalize these beliefs, 100%. Internalizes these beliefs. So then he believes that these beliefs are true. So all these things that the Venetians say, for example, he's monstrous, he's lascivious, he's violent, he's jealous, he is evil. All of these things, Othello then comes to believe himself. What else have we got? We've got sexual prejudice. The beliefs about women in the play, firstly, controlling their actions. Also, exposing them to judgment, rejection. I'm thinking Brabantio, for example. And it also leads to mistrust, right? So, for example, Othello and Desdemona, and he starts to view her differently when, for example, his misogyny, his doubt, is initiated, is provoked, right? We also have particularly Othello and Desdemona's marriage. As viewed both from the outside, external view of the marriage, so for example the Venetians' view, and the internal view. But the interaction between these two are interesting because which one is Othello? What is he relying on more? How his marriage seems from the inside or how his marriage seems from the outside? Because it seems like the latter in that point. We also want to think about prejudice as linked with violence. Here, being a cause of, a catalyst of, a consequence of, perhaps even a justification for. And then we want to think about the consequences of this, the harmfulness of this, the victims of prejudice. Because they are punished, right? They are ostracized. I'm thinking Othello, I'm thinking Desdemona in particular. I'm thinking they are met with violence and they are destroyed. But perhaps redeemed to a certain extent? Hard to say. Up to you to argue that. And we could also think of these victims as the direct victims of prejudice versus the indirect victims of prejudice. So, for example, Othello is a direct victim of prejudice because he is treated with racism by the Venetians, but when he internalizes this, he takes it out on Desdemona. So is Desdemona then an indirect victim of racial prejudice here? How it affects people, does it take over them, does it destroy them, etc.? This idea of vulnerability with prejudice, this idea of status with prejudice, the idea of monstrosity and prejudice, villainy and prejudice, anxieties and prejudice. Okay. So let's take a look at how we can organise this, because again, this is a lot of thoughts. Well, firstly, what do we need to include in an essay about prejudice? We've got to talk about Othello, right? We've got to talk about probably Desdemona. We've got to talk about the Venetians. We've got to talk about the Venetians. I would say we've probably got to talk about monstrosity here. We maybe have to talk about internalization. We've got to think about consequences. But we've also then probably got to talk about Jacobean prejudices. We've got to think about this as part of Shakespeare's project, so the catalyst that drives the action of the play. As something that affects all characters. That leads to the downfall here of the other characters. That is a form of control in society. And we've also got to talk about Shakespeare's own project here. Is he reflecting the prejudices of the time? Is he reinforcing them by saying, ha, look, knew it. Othello really does become this monster. Is he subverting them and getting us to challenge who the victim is in the society? Is it the Venetians or is it Othello? Who is the villain? Is it those who drove him to his destruction by creating such an intolerant society, or is it someone who was pushed beyond their boundaries, as Othello himself says? So there's a lot we have to include here. If we think about this as an essay structure, what we really want to do is use this structure in two ways. We want us to organize our thoughts. We want, ideally, this thesis statement here at the top, which is like your introduction, right? That sums up your ideas that you're going to include here. So we should have an idea by the end of your thesis statement of what is going to happen in your essay. Now, a thesis statement is a really good idea to work on ahead of time, because if you work out a structure that serves you well, then you can think about how a thesis statement structure or frame will allow you to answer a lot of questions easily. But really, that is our introduction. It introduces us to the concept of prejudice in the play. So where is it, essentially? Who does it affect? Not a list in total, but perhaps talking about how it affects all the characters or drives the trajectory of the play. We want to think about the consequences, and we want to think about Shakespeare's project and reflecting something in Jacobean society. So the fact that Jacobean society is prejudiced, and perhaps if we are really pushing ourselves with ambition, thinking about how this is different from Cinthio's play, which is the inspiration for Shakespeare's play, in which the short story is called Desdemona and the Moor, and Othello's antagonism by the Venetians is very much less exaggerated at the time, and it seems much more that Cinthio's version is a warning against girls of the time not to defy their fathers and run away and marry someone like Othello, but also to parents of the time to have a tight control over their daughters, or look what will happen to them, they'll end up dead by making all of these bad choices and being driven to it. Then, ideally, you are writing 5 paragraphs here. Because it's not a comparative essay, you have more time to get deep into the content here. That being said, it is much more important to have depth in your paragraphs than to ensure that you have 5 paragraphs every time. So you really want a really well crafted, detailed, explained paragraph for each of these. So if you can only manage to do 4 instead of 5, that's totally fine. But if you have extra time, you need to keep writing, because the expectation is 5 paragraphs. And we want these paragraphs to be specific, and we want these paragraphs to be organized. So I think it's always helpful to think about these in chronological order. From the start of the play, how is it presented? That would be idea 1, or paragraph 1 it will become. And then 2 and 3 will be where these shifts happen. So for example, when does the prejudice presented at the beginning that we look at in paragraph 1 change its form? So a different kind of prejudice, perhaps. Idea 4 is perhaps where we think about an alternative perspective, so a different kind of prejudice, or re-arguing a different point here. So for example, if we've said in the rest of our paragraphs that it is the Venetians' prejudice, we've talked about sexual prejudice, we've talked about Othello's prejudice, etc., monstrosity and prejudice and what Othello becomes, perhaps then we argue about some other character, so about specifically Iago's prejudice, or we think about someone like Desdemona being not prejudiced against Othello, and this being a kind of counterculture idea here, or counter-argument paragraph. And then in our final paragraph, we definitely want to talk about the ending, the consequences. If you have different ideas to talk about for the ending, paragraphs 4 and 5 can be different ideas about the ending, but certainly in at least one paragraph, you want to think about the consequences of prejudice being harmful. What happens? Destruction, right? Widespread in this play. So, for example, here, we want to think about, in our thesis, these are some ideas we want to include. And I'm actually going to bring this into a slightly different format so that I can write with a bit more space here and that you can perhaps read a little bit more clearly. So in our thesis statement, we want to introduce our answer to the question succinctly, we want to talk about how prejudice drives the trajectory of the play, the tragic consequences of prejudice, and Shakespeare's project, perhaps linking to Cinthio's version and key differences. When we talk about prejudice driving the trajectory of the play, perhaps linking to key affected characters. Hello, Neil, that's crying over AQA, welcome. Suraj Gupta, is that a little bit clearer? Apologies, my mic is on as high as it can go, so do let me know if I'm still being a bit quiet, because I am happy to try and shout a little bit louder here. But also do make sure your volume is up as loud as possible. Right, so then we're thinking about how we organize our ideas here. So for example, what is the catalyst of prejudice in the play? It is racial prejudice here. Serves as the catalyst of the play, because if everyone was fine with Othello and Desdemona's marriage, they wouldn't be at play, right? It would just be fine and everyone would be happy and would go off to Cyprus and have a nice time. Right. Then perhaps let's think about the other part of the prejudice at the beginning of the play. Yes, there is racial prejudice there as well, but who is it also affecting? Who is the butt of quite a lot of the jokes that Iago, Brabantio, and Roderigo are tossing around at the time? Apologies, just checking the chat. Okay, is that a little bit clearer in terms of the voice? Okay, Let's see. So who is the butt of these jokes? Desdemona, really. She is the white ewe being tupped by the old black ram. She is the daughter in the Moor and your daughter and making the beast with two backs, etc. And it is her sexuality and her behavior that also helps to catalyze the beginning of the play, because it is that starts the provocation of Othello. Because it's Brabantio and later Iago who says, well, she deceived me, so she'll deceive you. Again, if that is unsaid or unspoken or unprovoked, maybe this would be a different play, right? If there weren't these sexual prejudice that was rampant in a patriarchy that stigmatizes and American spelling polices women's behavior within the play, and perhaps links to Jacobean ideas of patriarchy and women's role. Okay. Then if we think about idea 3, okay, when does this start to change? This starts to change when Othello begins internalizing these ideas and begins particularly acting on these ideas. So rather than thinking of Othello as gentle Desdemona that he loves more than his unhoused free condition, he thinks of her as a whore and Emilia as a bawd, and as something that has a book that has the word whore written on it, that's contaminated and dirty here. So here then we have prejudice influencing Othello's view of Desdemona here, which leads to violence, a change in the power dynamic, cruelty between them, the sort of falling apart of the marriage, etc. Then, okay, getting towards the end, we've talked about different prejudices, but we haven't really thought about the effect of this prejudice on Othello specifically. What's the effect? He becomes this monster that Venetian society fears him to be. So, internalized prejudice makes him the monster that Venetian society believes him to be. Here. And then at the end, what are the consequences of prejudice? Total destruction, right? For Othello, Desdemona in particular, but also Brabantio, Iago to a lesser extent, Rodrigo, Emilia, everyone. And then the conclusion is not really a big deal. It can only be a couple of sentences, but really we'll just sum up your ideas. So for example, we'll say that prejudice serves as the driving force of the play, as it catalyzes the action, influences the interactions between the characters, and ultimately devolves into violence and destruction. And then another line about Shakespeare's project here. Okay, people are saying it's a little small. All right, I can try and zoom in a little bit for you. Bear with. Hopefully that's a little bit better for you. Vijay, is that any better? Wonderful. So, now that we're thinking of the different ideas, these are all really specific, right? So now we can organize our thoughts really well because we don't have to put the same quotations in different paragraphs. We can save our good quotations, our quotations about monstrosity, for example, for idea 4, paragraph 4, and focus particularly for paragraph 1 on act 1. And then not only are we able to control our ideas more and maybe organize our thoughts a bit more, we're also showing our own craft in our writing simply because it seems like we've had this plan from the start, because we've done this in play order. So a little bit of an extra point for you there if you think about these in terms of chronological play order, act order, because that means that your essay structure actually seems much more intentional than perhaps it is going into the exam itself. Okay? Apologies. Okay. So let's take a look at what an example thesis statement would look like. These are the things that a successful thesis statement will include. Are a clear addressal of the question, as I said. So that means you know you're answering the question. You're phrasing particularly the answer of the question. So if it says prejudice is harmful or prejudice in the question, you're including that ideally as the first word or the first couple of words in your thesis statement. Then you are explaining, as I said, how this question appears in the text through your arguments. And this is supposed to be the introduction to the ideas you're going to include extremely briefly. Again, showing your craft because you are introducing your ideas that you know you're going to talk about and thus showing how cohesive your argument is. Brief analysis of the consequences, effects, and links of this question in the text. So thinking about this not just as your couple of examples, but as affecting the play from the beginning, particularly to the ending. Linking to contextual factors that might have influenced this presentation or reaction to the play. And then a suggestion of the writer's intention. Obviously, we can't speak to Shakespeare, so we can't say for certain. So we need to use careful language. And linking to the source material and its key differences. So that would be Cinthio in this version. So I'm going to read, put in the chat anything you don't understand, anything you want to borrow for your own work, any language that you want to clarify, etc. So, prejudice is a fundamental theme in Shakespeare's Othello, as it serves as a form of social tyranny that drives the action of the play, leading to isolation, suspicion, and tragedy by its conclusion. Shakespeare utilized this theme to demonstrate the tragic consequences of prejudice in Jacobean society, in which prejudice is both corrosive and insidious, which means it's both fundamentally damaging as well as secretly damaging in a really negative way. So much so that it corrupts even the most resistant and victimized figures until prejudice becomes inseparable from reality and therefore fatal. Shakespeare's version of Cinthio's Desdemona and the Moor perhaps not solely retells the fatal story of daughterly transgression, but rather seeks to critique the destructive consequences of prejudice in a climate of fear fueled by anti-Catholic rhetoric and threats of domination by the Spanish and Ottoman Empire. So, does this include everything that I said you needed to? Well, firstly, we have this addressal of the question. If Shakespeare is saying here that or if the question is saying, I did this slightly differently. If Shakespeare is saying that prejudice is important, and if that's what our question is, then that is what we are saying in the first few words here. Yes, Vijay, it was pronounced or spelt Desdemona in the Cinthio version. Shakespeare changed that. And then explaining, as it serves, so that's our address of the question. And then explaining here, as it serves as a form of social tyranny, which means social control, being a tyrant, leading to isolation, suspicion, and tragedy. Okay, so these are going to be our themes here that we talk about, which makes sense because we have the Venetians talking to Othello with prejudice and about Othello with prejudice, so thus isolating him as an outsider. We also have suspicion, that's Othello, Brabantio, Iago acting with suspicion of Desdemona, for example, of Othello. Tyranny means being a tyrant or being an unfair, cruel leader. So if we're thinking as prejudice as a form of social tyranny, prejudice is a way of control in society. Then, brief analysis of the consequences, effects, links. Here we have it. To demonstrate the tragic consequences in which prejudice is, and then explain how damaging prejudice is corrosive until everyone submits to it and it becomes fatal. Then these last two bullet points are sort of joined together here. Contextual factors that might have influenced this here. Climate of fear fueled by anti-Catholic rhetoric. This is about the Jacobean era here. And writer's intention is that Shakespeare might have. Not just to retell the story, but to critique the consequences of prejudice, particularly in the society that he was in. Okay, so we can see it's only a couple of sentences, 1, 2, 3 sentences, but it carries quite a lot. It does quite a lot. And if you think about this thesis statement as a kind of outline for your own, we can say, okay, blank is a fundamental theme in Shakespeare's Othello as it serves as explain. Shakespeare utilized this theme to demonstrate the tragic consequences of blank, whatever your theme is, in Jacobean society, in which, then talk about that theme in Jacobean society. Then Shakespeare's version of Cinthio's Desdemona and the Moor maybe just doesn't retell the story, but seeks to critique, subvert, reinforce, question, challenge, change, educate, warn, etc. in a society in which explain why they need that warning. Right? So we've got a lot of meat out of these 3 sentences here. Now, this is a model paragraph for that first idea we talked about. So racial prejudice as the catalyst of the play, talking about the Venetians' prejudice in particular. And I've done this so that you can see what this looks like in a finished version. So you can see what a good A-level paragraph looks like. On the side in blue, I have what I do anyway when I'm writing is making a little list of the things I want to make sure I get, because as you're writing, you sort of become carried away, right? And so to ensure that I'm talking about the ideas that are important to me to answer how racial prejudice makes Othello an outsider in Venetian society, I've got my little list of bits I want to talk about here. So racialized epithets, the way that they talk about Othello, the court scenes in which Othello's being attacked, Brabantio's accusations of magic, the supernatural imagery. So there we've got the devices, so I'm making sure I tie those in. The black and white imagery, juxtaposition of Othello and Desdemona as racialized opposites. Animalistic descriptions, zoomorphism, motifs of contamination and filth that start here but then happen later, so we can link back to them in a third paragraph, fourth paragraph, fifth paragraph, whichever. Setting in the Venetian court, this public setting, that seems important for this idea of Othello being an outsider. Coleridge describing the marriage as monstrous, Newman describing it as unthinkable. That reflects what the Venetians would have thought. So let's include that and we can see how it actually works out. Vijay, it looks like a universe. Yeah, well, it's quite a lot of writing, yes, but this is the expectation for A-level writing, is this kind of deep thought and engagement with this specific argument. So I'm going to read, and it'll take me a couple of minutes. Feel free to put any words you don't know, any ideas you want explained a little bit more, any parts you want to take for your own writing, any parts you think could be improved, any parts that you're not sure why I've concluded them in this paragraph versus another, any ideas, feel free to put in the chat and I'm going to read it out loud. Okay. Shakespeare presents racial prejudice as the catalyst of the play. So that was what we had in our plan. We've done it. As it is Othello and Desdemona's transgressive interracial marriage that ignites the prejudice of Venetian society and catalyzes the marriage's tragic collapse in a murder-suicide whose violence shakes the very foundations of Venetian society. So there, all I'm doing is talking about it's the catalyst of the play because everyone is angry about this marriage. Then I always find it helpful to talk about why Shakespeare would do this at the beginning, so that you have part of your AO3, part of talking about the context at the beginning, so you don't forget to put it in later. It's part of explaining why it's presented like this. So perhaps here Shakespeare captures the heightened racism of an England newly engaged in the transatlantic slave trade and for whom accounts of colonizers constructed a mythicized and prejudiced offering of people, of people outside of England, possibly coloured by the deep-seated and racialized anxieties regarding blackness embedded within Jacobean Christianity. The play, following conventions of Greek tragedy, begins in media res, with Iago's embittered and graphic descriptions of Othello as the Moor who has flouted military conventions and the old black ram who is tupping Brabantio's beloved daughter Desdemona. Jacobean fears of blackness and miscegenation immediately would be antagonized by the hyperbolic and animalistic images planted in mind by Iago's carefully constructed descriptions. Okay, what have I said so far? I've said that Shakespeare is capturing the extreme racism influenced by the slave trade and by the colonizers' accounts that would have exaggerated Jacobean fears of blackness and interracial marriages and children from interracial marriages. And this othering was linked to Said, where it says Said in a quotation, in parentheses. That's because this idea of othering comes from Said's work, so I'm referencing him. Then the play following Greek tragedy. So we're talking about the fact that Iago introduces it as the narrator does from Greek tragedy, beginning in the middle of the play, not starting with the marriage, and talking about and complaining about Othello and Desdemona's marriage and the fact that the way he describes it would immediately make the Jacobeans angry and fearful. In considering miscegenation immediately, or in considering Greek tragic tradition, one could consider Iago in the role of the chorus, whose voice would serve as that of society, both foreshadowing the marriage's fate while also embodying contemporary society's deeply felt prejudice for a marriage that transgresses both class and racial lines and disrupts the great chain of being. Despite Othello's self-assurance that he is of royal siege, Venetian society remains horrified by this marriage. Shakespeare's construction of Brabantio's tirade, antagonized by Iago from the man who loved Othello, against the marriage perhaps echoes the mythicized accounts of Elizabethan and Jacobean colonizers in the Age of Discovery, whose narratives of blackness and of Africa included Leo Africanus's 1550 description of black Africans as very proud and high-minded and woefully addicted unto wrath. Thus, the supernatural imagery in Brabantio's accusations of chains of magic, foul charms, and witchcraft that reflects the fantastical depictions of non-Christian religious beliefs of the contemporary era. Royal siege means he was born of noble warriors. And here we're saying that Iago, if we're saying that he comes from Greek tragedy in the way that Shakespeare started off the play, the conventions he used, then Iago actually is saying what society is thinking. And so all of his objections to the marriage is actually what society's reactions would be. And thus Shakespeare is revealing through this villainous character how prejudiced society at the time was. And that Brabantio, yelling at Othello about the marriage, talking about magic, foul charms and witchcrafts, actually reflects what Jacobean people thought of the time of black people, and comes from references like this text from 1550 in which black people were described as both containing supernatural powers as well as monstrous in a way. These depictions of witchcraft, I'm starting here, these depictions of witchcraft align with Africa, juxtaposed with the presentation of Desdemona as divine and blessed, the embodiment of the Christian Virgin Mary. Thus, Brabantio's reaction is not an aberration, which means it's not an unusual one, but rather reflective of a society in which this marriage is unthinkable and monstrous on both racial and religious lines. Newman Coleridge. Perhaps Shakespeare uses the setting as a way to highlight that these are not personal prejudices, but rather indicative of a deeply racist society in which this marriage offends not only Brabantio, but his brothers of state, who he feels are also insulted by this transgression. As such, Brabantio aligns himself familiarly, which means as a family member, with Venice, and thus linguistically ostracizes Othello. Clearly, he views the marriage as a threat to Venetian hierarchy, a loosely veiled version of contemporary Jacobean society in which the rigidity of power was unquestioned by the divine right of kings. So what is this saying? This is saying the presentation of Othello as monstrous and lined with witchcraft, and Africa juxtaposed, contrast with Desdemona being pure, holy, and linked with Christian Virgin Mary. So they are opposite characters to the Venetians and to Brabantio. And here, Brabantio talks about his brothers in Venice. So the idea of all of the court being like his brothers. So thinking that it's not just him who's being affected by this, but all of Venice that's being affected by this. It's a threat to their way of life in his eyes, and that because Venice is really Jacobean society, but Shakespeare is trying to make that a little bit less obvious, that really this is revealing about the actual fears actual Jacobeans had about who had power in society. And then I'm starting now from here. And that divine right of kings, that's context there, so that's AO3, linking to this idea of, well, if people can question the power of society, that's threatening our way of life, and the power of the king being on top of everyone else. Brabantio seeks to separate the couple for fear of contamination in society. Thus, the description of fair Desdemona running from her guardage to the sooty bosom of Othello suggests not only fear of the union, but of the contamination to Venetian nobility. Thus, the light and dark imagery and the motif of contamination across the play takes on further significance as it reflects the anxieties regarding miscegenation, as Desdemona becomes the symbolic handkerchief that is soiled by her contact with Othello. Thus, this fear of contamination is foregrounded at the start of the play and later embedded into Othello's own language. Clearly, his own views of his wife, who has sacrificed everything for him, have now been altered by the dominating prejudice of Venetian society. Liebes. Is this his view completely or a little? In truth. Vijay, this is Brabantio's view, but this is Brabantio's view, who's a very racist character. So it's still a racist view, and it's reflecting real racist views of the time, but it is character. As the play begins after the marriage, the audience is unable to see an Othello unaware of these prejudices. By the time the play commences, it's clear that prejudice is deeply ingrained in all of the characters, and it is this that becomes the judge and jury for this fated match. Perhaps here Shakespeare captures the ubiquity of racism and prejudice in society and its power to influence even the most uncorruptible characters. So then, what is this saying? This is saying that Brabantio is afraid that the marriage between Othello and Desdemona is going to contaminate Venetian bloodlines. And that all of this, not just this one instance, but this continues across the play, this motif of contamination, dark and light in the play. And then this becomes something that Othello internalizes and takes it on later. And this is then referencing to our later paragraph where we talk about this. And then as the play begins after the marriage, the audience is unable to see. So the reason that this play starts after the marriage has taken place is because we want immediately these prejudices to start influencing the marriage. Not that we want that, but that's what Shakespeare wants to present it as, is that this marriage is unable to escape prejudice, and thus that prejudice is going to influence it from the very start. Ubiquity means that it is universal. Ubi means world, so this idea of it being all across the world. And here Shakespeare then is suggesting that prejudice is everywhere in the society and it influences everyone, even those who are victims themselves. Okay? So anything any people want to borrow, people want to ask about, people want to have explained here in this paragraph? Take a moment to type should you need to. Anything? Okay. Did we cover everything we feel we needed to talk about how this play starts off with prejudice? I think we've done okay so far. So now let's take a look at another idea, right? I feel like I can feel a life in his character. Vijay, okay, so you feel like you understand him a bit more now. That's great. Now we're going to talk about the sexual prejudice, right? So this is again from the beginning where we're talking about the reaction of the characters to the marriage, but focusing now on sexual prejudice. So thinking of them as talking about Desdemona now. And you'll notice we didn't talk a huge amount about Desdemona in the first paragraph. That's because we're saving it for here where we can get into it more deeply rather than kind of glazing over it all the time but not actually sinking our teeth into the analysis of it. So what would we want to include in a paragraph about Desdemona and prejudice here at the beginning? What would we want to include? This is us thinking here what we'd want to include. There we are. Bear with me just while I try to make this slightly bigger. Is that a little bit bigger for everyone? Can see a little bit better. Hooray. Great. Wonderful. Okay, so what would we want to include? I would say we would definitely have to talk about the graphic sexual imagery. So for example, the old black ram tupping your white ewe, but focusing on the white ewe at that point. The gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. Your daughter and the Moor are making the beast. I think that's a... with two backs, and your daughter is covered by a Barbary horse. Your nephews will neigh to you, and perhaps even the devil will make a grandsire of you. So why am I including so many little quotations there? Because I'm trying to organize my thoughts so that I can tie all of these into a pattern. Because again, another difference between A-level and GCSE is that in GCSE you talk about one quotation, then you talk about another one, then you talk about another one, then you talk about another one. In A-level, you really want to talk about little clusters of quotations at once to show that there are patterns going on here. That is actually the more difficult but higher ranking skill there. So there is dehumanizing language regarding Desdemona here that speaks to her defiance and judgment about her. So Vijay said, yes, discrimination both on the black people and the women here. Yes. Character, etc. And this then perhaps linking to that later point, she did deceive her father and may thee, which Brabantio warns Othello. And then later Iago warns, she did deceive her father marrying you, and Othello responds, and so she did. So then this trajectory of doubt here, as soon as she is judged for her marriage, this is then par for the course that everyone can judge her because she made that one decision they disagreed with. That any doubt of her character can be stemmed back to that one choice. We can also think of something like thieves, look to your daughter, your bags, etc. This is Iago and Roderigo talking to Brabantio, this idea of possession, ownership with women that speaks to their status in society. What else can we talk about? We can talk about the language of contamination with her and the consequences of it. Brabantio disowning her. here. And then he dies off stage, as in this is too much for him. And we have this idea then that Foister suggests to us, who's one of our critics, saying that the key to male power in the household was thought to be sexual control of women. So this idea then of her behavior actually influencing the treatment and experience not only of her but of women, of men of the time as well. Bear with, I'm just having a little bit of technical difficulties here. Okay, so with this then, we have got a beginning of a paragraph, and we can plan in our next 5 minutes of lesson, or our last 5 minutes of lesson, where we can do with this. And I can see that to W myself, will this help in competitive exams? Yes, because this will help you to write well, to formulate your thoughts well, to formulate your arguments well, even if it's not about your particular mark scheme, because I haven't taught in the Indian system before of education. This will certainly help with thinking about how you craft arguments and how you think about writing at a high level. So, Harsh Pandey, grammar. Let me see what I can do, because we've got quite a full curriculum. But if you take a look at my reels and my social media, there's quite a lot about grammar and vocab as well. Okay, so I'm going to read what we've got so far, and then we can think about how we can continue to add to it. So, Shakespeare presents the influence of sexual prejudice that stigmatizes and polices women's behaviour through the portrayal of Desdemona and her trajectory across the play. A tragic trajectory across the play. Indeed, it's not just Othello, but Venetian society as a whole that determines Desdemona's fate, even the suggestion of her infidelity is justifiably enough to condemn her to her fate. Shakespeare perhaps highlights the draconian prejudice of society that predicates women's position as fundamental to the preservation of male reputation and status. So sexual prejudice is initially presented as, and let's say Brabantio, Iago, Rodrigo, right? As a condemnation of any woman who fails to exemplify the expectations of purity and obedience required of Jacobean women. Desdemona's transgressive marriage then becomes doubly transgressive, as not only does she marry without her father's permission, but she also marries someone who her father would view or views as monstrous and entirely unacceptable as a husband. Now, I'm aware we're already starting to go off our time, so let's just talk about where we'll go next. We will talk about the possession here, the fact that Brabantio describes her as a possession, and that she is then owned by him. So this explains why he's so affronted by her transgression, because he is expected to make these decisions for her. So this is affecting his reputation. And as we can see, Foister says, this affects then his control over not only her, but also of his reputation and his life in Venice, his public life in Venice. Perhaps that's why he takes her to the public court